Well, welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 19, verse 17, which reads, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done." You know, the reason I wanted to look at this verse in particular is because I feel like generosity towards people in need is something almost every major moral framework in human history has affirmed in some form, right? Whether it's religious or even secular, Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, virtually every ethical tradition has something to say about the responsibility of those who have toward those who do not. So on the surface, a verse about being kind to the poor might seem like familiar territory, like something most people would nod at without much resistance. But Proverbs 19:17 here does not make the standard argument for generosity. It does not appeal to compassion, social responsibility, or even the general principle that caring for the vulnerable is the right thing to do. It makes a claim that is far more startling than any of those arguments, and one that completely reframes the transaction of generosity at its fundamental level. When we are kind to the poor, Solomon says, we are lending to God, not contributing to society, not investing in human flourishing in some abstract sense, right? Lending to God. The one who created everything, who owns everything, who lacks nothing, is described as the recipient of a loan from us when we extend kindness to someone who has less than we do. This is an almost disorienting claim when you actually sit with it, but it deserves far more than a casual nod of agreement from us. So let's break down the verse. Whoever is kind to the poor, let's start there, right? The word kind here translates a Hebrew verb that means to show grace or favor, to extend goodwill to someone in a tangible and active way. It is not a feeling of sympathy or a general attitude of warmth towards people who are struggling. It is something done, an action taken, right? The kindness Solomon is describing has visible, concrete expression rather than remaining at the level of good intentions. And the poor refers throughout Proverbs and the broader Old Testament to those who are genuinely materially lacking, right? People whose circumstances have left them without the resources to meet their own basic needs. Proverbs has a great amount of things to say about the poor across multiple chapters, and it's worth briefly tracing that thread because it shows how central this concern is to Solomon's moral vision. Proverbs 14:31 states the principle that underlies our verse most directly. He says, "Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him." Right? The connection between how we treat the poor and how we are treating God is not unique to Proverbs 19:17. It is a consistent theme. The poor person is not just a social category. They are a human being made in the image of God, and how we respond to them is, in some real sense, how we respond to God. And then even a couple chapters ago in Proverbs 17:5, he reinforces this from the negative direction, right? So whoever mocks the poor insults his maker. And so again, right, the maker appears as the one who takes the treatment of the poor personally. And this is not incidental to the argument of Proverbs 19:7, but it is the theological foundation underneath it. God identifies with the poor in a way that means our treatment of them reaches him directly. And I think this is where an important clarification about the verse is needed, right? Because Proverbs 19:17 is not making an argument that poverty is always the result of laziness or always the result of injustice, right? Proverbs itself contains observations in both directions, acknowledging both that foolish choices can produce poverty and that unjust systems can trap people in it. And so the verse does not ask us to resolve that debate before extending kindness, but it simply says whoever is kind to the poor without qualifying which poor or under which circumstances, that the call to kindness is not contingent on our assessment of how someone arrived at their current state of need. And then let's get to this money part of it, right? Lends to the Lord. This is the phrase that makes the verse really remarkable, and I think it deserves the most careful attention of anything in these two lines, because the verb lends is a financial term. It's not metaphorical or poetic shorthand for something vague. It is the language of an actual transaction, a loan extended with the expectation of repayment. And so the implied logic is as follows. The poor person cannot repay what you give them. They do not have the resources. But God, who identifies with the poor and takes their treatment personally, steps into the transaction and assumes the debt. And so by extending kindness to someone who cannot repay you, you have effectively, essentially extended a loan to God himself, who both can repay and has explicitly promised to do so. And I think this reframes generosity toward the poor in a way that dismantles one of the most common psychological barriers to it. Because we often resist giving to people in genuine need because there is no return on investment from a human perspective, right? We know the person can't pay us back, so there is no social capital to be gained, no financial return. Sorry, I'm using like financial terms right here. So like I hope these are kind of common, so I hope I'm not losing you in the Wall Street sauce by saying these type of things. But what I mean is there's basically no reciprocal benefit in the ordinary sense of giving to the poor. And so the transaction feels entirely one directional and therefore, by the logic of how we normally operate, somewhat irrational. But Proverbs 19:17 says we have fundamentally misidentified the other party in the transaction. We are not giving to someone who cannot repay us. We are lending to someone who absolutely can and who has the character and the resources to make good on every debt. And so the person in need was never the end point of their transaction. They were the means through which God received what we extended and assumed the obligation of repayment himself. And so Jesus develops the same logic in Matthew 25:31-40 in the New Testament with language that is almost a direct commentary on Proverbs 17. And if you're going to listen to anyone, at least listen to Jesus. In the parable of the sheep and the goats, I've actually looked at this passage before. I've read this passage before. And this is, ironically, I'm not going to lie, ironically, this is one of the first passages that came to my mind when I actually read this first Proverbs 19:17, because it paints the picture. I'll go over the story. I'll go over the story so that you understand what I'm talking about. But basically, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the king says to the righteous, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. The righteous are confused in this story because they do not remember doing any of these things for the king. And he responds, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. And so the identification between God and the poor, between the treatment of the vulnerable and the treatment of God himself, could not be stated more directly. And so what Proverbs 19:17 frames as lending to the Lord, Jesus frames as doing it to him personally. That's what I basically was trying to get at. Because, once we start to reframe our view on lending to the poor as lending to God himself because he delights in he almost delights in the state, he resonates with the state of the poor in that moment, that really ought to make us change, right? And then this next part of the verse, and he will reward them for what they have done, I think states the promise plainly. Right? God will reward the person who has been kind to the poor. For context, the Hebrew word for reward carries the sense of repaying, of returning what was given, of making good on an obligation, right? And so it's basically the language of debt settlement. God's not offering a vague blessing in the general direction of generous people. He's describing himself as a debtor who repays. And the nature of the reward is not specified in the verse itself, which is deliberate. Right, Proverbs throughout its wisdom literature resists reducing God's responses to formulas and specific predictions. What's specified is the certainty of the reward, not its exact form. And so God will repay. The transaction will be completed, and the loan extended to the poor will come back from the one who assumed the debt in time. I love how and I love how in 2 Corinthians 9:6-8, Paul applies the same principle in the New Testament context. He says, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And so each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And so the cheerful giver is not cheerful because they have done the financial math and concluded that generosity is a good investment strategy. No, they're cheerful because they have understood something about the nature of God and the nature of the transaction that makes the giving genuinely joyful rather than reluctant. And so let's get practical here. Let's get applicable here, because as I always say in my videos, I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important things that we can do in our Christian walk. And so the first thing for us, I think, is to let this verse change how we actually perceive the moment of giving, right? Because the most transformative application of Proverbs 19:7 is not a new giving strategy or a commitment to be more generous in the abstract. Is actually a shift in perception about what is actually happening in the moment when we extend kindness to someone in need. If we truly believe that God is the one receiving the loan and God is the one who will repay it, the transaction looks entirely different than if we are simply giving to a person who cannot pay us back. And so practically, this means the next time we have an opportunity to be kind to someone who cannot reciprocate, to give someone in genuine need, to extend help to someone with no obvious return on investment, we consciously remind ourselves of who Solomon says is actually on the other side of that transaction. And that reframing does not manufacture generosity out of nothing, but it does address the most common psychological barrier to it, the feeling that giving to those who cannot repay is a loss rather than a loan. The second thing is to examine whether our generosity is reaching people who genuinely cannot reciprocate, right? I think it is possible to be quite generous within a network of people who can and do repay us in various forms through reciprocal invitations, social capital, professional relationships, and mutual benefit without ever extending genuine kindness to people who cannot offer anything in return. But that kind of giving is real and has value, but it isn't. But let's not get it twisted, right? It's not what Proverbs 19:17 is describing. The verse is specifically about kindness to the poor, to people whose circumstances mean they genuinely lack the ability to repay what is extended to them. And so an honest audit of our giving and generosity might reveal that the people who can reciprocate are receiving most of it, while those who cannot are receiving little. But that gap is worth addressing, not out of guilt, but out of the genuine understanding that the transaction with those who cannot repay is the one that goes straight to God. And the third thing is to give in a way that reflects the character of the God we are lending to. Because since Proverbs 19:7 frames our kindness to the poor as a transaction with God himself, the manner of our giving should reflect something of his character. Right? In Deuteronomy 15:10-11, he gives us God gives a standard. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. Because for this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all you undertake. And so the grudging gift, the reluctant contribution, the bare minimum extended with visible resentment does not reflect the generous character of the God to whom we are lending. God gives generously and without reproach, as James 1:5 established in the New Testament. Our giving to the poor as an extension of his character into the world should carry something of that same spirit. Cheerful, free, and without the kind of accounting that is always calculating what we might get back. So let me just give some closing thoughts here. Proverbs 19:17 is one of those verses that reorganizes everything around it once its logic fully lands. It takes the familiar call to generosity toward the poor and places it within a framework that makes ordinary financial reasoning completely inadequate to describe what is happening. Again, we're not giving to people who cannot repay us. We are lending to God who can and who has promised that he will. And that changes the math. It changes the motivation. And it changes the feeling in that moment of giving from reluctant sacrifice to something closer to the cheerfulness Paul describes in the New Testament. The natural response of someone who has understood, who is actually on the other side of their transaction. Again, like the poor person in front of us is not the end of the story. They are the means through which God receives what we offer and assumes the debt himself. So we got to lend freely, for he is good for it.